Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Perennial and well-respected Catholic journalist Diane Montagna has released documents that were given to her that show that the rationale behind the canceling of the traditional Latin Mass in many places issued by Pope Francis in 2021 was based on false pretenses, which is a big problem, and it corroborates what many of us expected. There is something interesting in that document about the SSPX that I believe demonstrates the modernist understanding of communion and why no traditionalist really has full communion with the church in the modern understanding. We're going to discuss that. Stay tuned. All right, I'm going to pull up the document here in a second, and then we're going to move on to something else because other commentators have already talked about what Pope Francis said, and I'm late to the game here. Yesterday was Canada Day, Dominion Day, so I was off when this big news thing came out, so I wasn't around to talk about it. Fair enough. But before we do that, ladies and gentlemen, if you do own a home and you need to buy another home or sell your home, then you're going to want to find a real estate agent that you can trust. If you're going to do that, you're going to hopefully find somebody who believes the same things you do about big moral questions. And there are a lot of those involved with home sales and purchasing. And for that, you're going to want to go to Real Estate for Life. Catholic real estate agents will be offered to you. You can be set up with one, whether you're buying or selling, and they'll help you. And I've had great feedback from people who have used it. I support Real Estate for Life. Check the link underneath and tell them Kennedy sent you. And last thing I will say, if you are a person living in 2025, you probably do have a cell phone. I have one right here. And it's actually a flip phone, funny enough, although it does have Android in it, so I can do emails and things. But the point is, you use a cell phone even if you're not using a full-on smartphone. And if you do that, you pay somebody to use those services. Stop paying people, stop paying big companies that do things like support all the stupid nonsense in our culture, and instead support a Catholic company. And that's why you're going to want to support iCatholic Mobile. Link for them underneath. Your money goes not only to a company that employs Catholics and serves Catholics, but also supports traditional religious communities. It's a win-win for everybody. All right. Now, what happened recently? Well, I'll just pull it up quickly here. As I said, other commentators have gone over this a lot, so I'm not going to add more to it that they've already said because I'll just be repeating them. And it's a document it's a Substack article from Diane Montagna, and its official Vatican report exposes major cracks in foundation of Traditionis Custodes. And basically, again, I'm just going to give you the Coles notes here. What is this? Well, when Traditionis Custodes came out in 2021, the idea was that there was this survey put out to bishops, and the supposed rationale behind putting out Traditionis Custodes is that all these TLM communities were causing so many problems, and Pope Francis was just responding to that and cracking down. Now, the thing is, so many of us who attend the traditional Mass, no matter where we attend, we've often seen the complete opposite. We've seen that it's so helpful to families. We've also seen that in many cases, even kind of liberal bishops are totally happy to let the TLM crowd, let them live in, or let live and let be, because they recognize that they're not fire-breathing dragons. They may not be, the bishops may not be traditionalists, but they're happy that Catholics have a place to go and be. And quite frankly, let's be honest, they like it that they go to diocesan parishes because that means the money goes to the diocese rather than that pesky SSPX, etc. And so it was kind of a win-win for most. And most people were very shocked by Pope Francis's thing because they thought this doesn't match reality. Well, it turns out it doesn't match reality. And you can read her report. Or after this, if you want to get the real ins and outs of that, go check out Taylor Marshall's stream on it. He did one yesterday. Other guys did as well. Avoiding Babylon talked about it. And also the English folks from the Commonwealth over across the sea. God Save the King and all that. I can say that as a Canadian because he is technically the King of Canada, not just the King of England. He's the King of Canada on his own. Interesting little historical tidbit. And the folks at Catholic Unscripted did a thing on it as well, and they went through it in more detail. But what did it show? It showed that the vast majority of bishops, so the actual reports that were given to the Holy See when they put out the survey, did not say that the TLM was a big problem. In fact, it was overwhelmingly positive that they were happy to have the TLM. a lot of modernist gobbledygook, doublespeak going on in these documents, but nonetheless, they were happy to have them in there, some emphatically so. But we were told that the TLM had to be canceled because it caused so much division. Well, that wasn't actually what the bishops themselves had said. So that's the big bombshell behind that. But there's something interesting in the assessment of the survey, which I want to show you here. And it's illustrative of a continuing problem that we face. It's illustrative of the fruits of modernism that we face. And it's something to be aware of. And ironically, according to this, which is not a magisterial document, this isn't something that like Catholics are required to believe by faith or something like that, because quite frankly, it's just some sort of document that is, the results of a survey. I don't even think it approaches the level of something magisterial. Nonetheless, it is representative of the mindset of the authors of it, which do represent the bishops of the world, which is fascinating for our purposes. So what am I talking about here? Okay, so here is the document that Diane has on her Substack, and she released an English translation of the Italian version of the document that she has, and I do speak Italian and read and write in Italian, and the translation is accurate, just so everyone's can't do the whole, it's not a good translation. No, it's a good translation, trust me. And I'm just going to do a quick little Control F search here, and I put in SSPX. So let's do SSPX. So here's a fascinating line. Let's look at this line here, and I'll make this a little bit bigger for you. And again, this is a document showing basically what the bishops of the world thought about the TLM. After a complex initial phase and with some situations still pending, thanks to the motu proprio Summorum Pontificum, these groups of faithful, and indeed the bishops and priests themselves, have found stability and serenity, having in the former PCED, that's the Pontifical Commission Ecclesiae Dei, which handles the traditional groups in the church historically, or since 1988, and then it was closed, I think, in 2019. And now the fourth section, which is a section of the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, formerly Congregation of the Faith, a calm, stable, and authoritative point of reference that guarantees their rights as well as their duties. Funny enough, interesting. So, according to the bishops of the world, this is the summary of what they said. They loved having the traditional Mass in the way that it was because it gave the faithful their rights. And what are their rights? Well, they have a right to the traditional Mass because they can't take that away. Anyway, and it was calm, stable, etc. Indeed, some bishops note that it is necessary to protect the stable groups to prevent departures from the church toward schismatic communities or the SSPX. In all places where the stable groups are accompanied and supported by the diocesan bishop or by a delegated priest, there are virtually no more problems, and the faithful are content to be guided, respected, and treated as children by their father bishop. This is a fascinating statement. Let's read that again. Some bishops note that it is necessary to protect the stable groups to prevent departures from the church toward schismatic communities or the SSPX. What does that mean? Well, there's a distinction there between schismatic communities and the SSPX. So, how are we to make sense of that? Well, we'll go back to the document because there's something here that is demonstrative of something else. Let me pull this up here. If I'm just going to do a quick Control F search of full communion. Some bishops, this is on the next page, some bishops state that the motu proprio has failed in its aim of fostering reconciliation and therefore request its suppression, either because internal reconciliation within the church has not been fully achieved or because the priestly fraternity has not, the SSPX has not returned to full communion with the church. So there's some fascinating things here. So internal reconciliation within the church has not been fully achieved, or because the priestly fraternity has not returned to full communion with the church, the SSPX. So what are we to make of this? So on the one hand, the document says there is discord within the church and there's not reconciliation yet fully, whatever that means. On the other hand, they don't want people to go to schismatics communities or the SSPX because apparently they're not the same thing. But at the same time, the document says the SSPX does not have full communion. How are we to make sense of this? Because by traditional Catholic theology, you're either in the church or outside the church. What this document's basically saying is that you can be sort of in the church, you can be kind of apart from the church, but also not in schism. And at the same time, you could be in the church, but also not reconciled with the church. It's very confusing. This is the problem of modernism. But there is precedent for this. And I'm going to show you where this comes from. So I wrote an article a little while back on my Substack. It was, when was it? It was in January of 2024, so about a year and a half ago. And in this article, and I'll just show you on the screen here. And if you want more stuff like this that I'm going to show you, you can sign up for my Substack. The link for that is underneath. If you're listening to this on Substack, you're already there, but you can update to a premium subscriber and get stuff that you won't otherwise get. I wrote an article about how if you join the SSPX, you're going to go partially to hell. And what was my point of this? And again, I'll link this article underneath. I've had many conversations with people about the society. Of course I have, given what I do. Long before I was even, talking on the internet, I was having these conversations. And even since I've been talking on the internet, I have many conversations behind the scenes with curious people who want to ask questions, and I love good faith conversations. I did write my book, SSPX The Defense, because those conversations can get tiresome, and not because I don't want to talk to people, but because there's only so many hours in the day. So I usually point people to that book, and that's what I think, and there you go. Nonetheless, one of the things that I've seen is a plague of this modernist mindset is that no one really knows who's in the church and who's not in the church. And this creates great confusion, because let's just back up here for a sec. Why would anyone care where anyone went to church unless it was necessary to be in the church for a really important reason? Traditionally, as Catholics, we would believe that it's necessary to be in the church so we can go to heaven. We are baptized into the mystical body of Christ, and then we go to heaven if we are in a state of grace when we die. This is basic catechism. Any 7-year-old can tell you this who's preparing for First Communion, as long as it's not some wacky First Communion course. And the way that you stay in a state of grace is you either confess mortal sins when you commit them, pretty basic, or you don't commit them. So, one of the mortal sins that could separate us from God would be the sin of schism. Just like you could have the sin of heresy, just like you could have the sin of adultery, different types of sins. What is the sin of schism? The sin of schism is a sin against charity. It's a sin against the love that binds Christians together, basically, with God, not just with each other, but in that mystical body, we do something to sever ourselves from communion with those in the body and from God through his visible head, who is the leader of the body. That's basically what it is. So schism basically has kind of a vertical element and it has a horizontal element. So we could separate ourselves from the church in the vertical sense, meaning we sort of reject the principle of the hierarchy, or we reject the principle of the authoritative supreme nature of the pontiff, of the pope. This would be like an Eastern Orthodox schism. And they would also, of course, tell us that we're schismatics, but anyway, neither here nor there. Or we could have a schism that is in a horizontal sense, which is refusal to commune or to be a part of the church or recognize our communion in the church with our fellow Catholics. And I'll show you that that's in the modern catechism. I misspoke there. I meant to say the new Code of Canon Law, not the new catechism. In any event, here is Canon 751 from the new Code of Canon Law. And I'll make this a little bit smaller so we can all see it on the screen. There you go. So Canon 751. It says, heresy is the obstinate denial or obstinate doubt after the reception of baptism of some truth which is to be believed by divine and Catholic faith. That's interesting. Let's just pause there for a sec. Heresy or is the obstinate denial or obstinate doubt after the reception of baptism of some truth which is to be believed by divine and Catholic faith. Well, how many people would count as heretics if it's just obstinate doubt? How many bishops might count as heretics, quite frankly? Just being honest. According to the new code, if you don't like it, change the code. Maybe the code's wrong, but this is what your code that you're using in the modern church, so-and-so in charge. This is what it says. Apostasy is the total repudiation of the Christian faith. Schism is the refusal of submission to the supreme pontiff. Basic, that's the vertical, up, right, up and down. Or of communion with the members of the church subject to him. Schism is refusal of submission to the Roman pontiff, or of communion with the members of the church subject to him. Now, we have to be a little bit more philosophical and theological here. We have to understand that there are instances wherein one's submission exists in principle or exists as a matter of a basic understanding, but then there are certain instances where it could be impossible to submit for various reasons. I mean, the classic example is the Pope asking you to go kill your brother. It's like, well, I can't do that. But I still submit to you as the Pope, and in principle, you are the head of the church, but I can't do that. That's a silly example, but it's just a for instance. So it doesn't mean that we have to do everything that always happens, always from our hierarchs, because that wouldn't always be possible. But at the same time, the desire to submit has to be there. The principled submission is there. And how would we demonstrate this? Well, historically, one would demonstrate this with objective ways. And those would be, if I go to the article that I wrote, which again, I'll link underneath. And let me just find the spot here. The way that you would demonstrate this, well, you believe the Catholic faith, you partake in the Catholic sacraments, and you recognize the governance of the legitimate pastors of the church. This is the basic way. This is objective. We can only really judge things based objectively, because things that are subjective or internal or unseen or relative to context, we clearly can't make judgments on that unless we actually talk to the person. This is why even in our codes of law for our societies, we will have someone accused of a crime, and then we have that person tried and interviewed and testimony and evidence and cross-examination and all these kinds of things. Why? Because we have to know the person did it. We can't just suspect the person did it. So when it comes to things like accusing somebody of schism, we have to know that they they don't submit to the Pope. We have to know that they want to separate themselves from the church. We can't just assume they are. If you assume, you make an ASS out of UME, right? So when it comes to vertical schism, meaning separation from the Pope, it has to be clear that we reject those three things, that we reject communion with the church objectively. This is the traditional understanding. On the other hand, when we have the horizontal schism, this is where we refuse to commune with those subject to the Pope. Now, of course, we don't actually have to, or it says refusal of communion. Of course, we don't actually have to go to the same parishes as other Catholics to be a part of the church with them. That would be absurd. I mean, there are many different continents with different Catholics on them, and I've never been to Australia, and I'd love to go one day, but I'll probably never. Maybe I won't go ever. I'd love to. I'm a huge rugby fan, so Australia, New Zealand is kind of like the promised land in that way. But if I never get there, I'm still in communion with those Catholics, because when I go to Mass, I am part of the church with them. And I go to the same altars that they go to, in principle, because they're of the same church. So how does one become a schismatic in the horizontal sense? Well, again, I'm not saying anything about people officially here, but if we were to follow this logic, well, it says refusal of communion with those subject to him. So how would one demonstrate that? Well, they could do it in particular instances in their lives. They could be like, I'm never going to that church because they're not true Catholics. We can't say that. We can say, I don't want to go to that parish because it's a really bad priest and they have really bad preaching and really bad sacrilege. I mean, those are just reasons of protecting one's faith. But if the principle is they're not Catholics by my judgment, I will never go there because I don't view them as Catholic. That would be a schismatic mentality. It would be. And you see this with Catholics on all sides of the spectrum. But again, this is subjective, so we can't accuse anyone of this in the formal sense because we don't have evidence of it and they haven't been tried and there's nothing we could do there. But the warning does exist in canon law. I had a conversation with a vicar of my diocese back in 2020. And he was trying to tell me I was, incorrect for telling people that the SSPX was in the Catholic Church. And we spent about an hour and a half going over tons of information. By the end of the conversation, we got to the point where he admitted they weren't in excommunication. He admitted they weren't even under penalties because there were reasons for that. He admitted that they had Catholic baptism. He admitted that they were not in schism. but he would refuse to admit that they were in the church. And I said, why? And he said, because they're not in union with the church. It was a mind-numbingly frustrating conversation because I don't know how one can not be in schism, not be excommunicated, and not be penalized, but somehow not be in union with the church. There are so many logical contradictions there, because if one would recognize that they could be penalized, they would necessarily have to be subject to penalties of the church, which means they'd have to be in it. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Modernism was where reason goes to die. And this sort of mentality is consistent with the modern understanding of communion, where one can be a non-schismatic. So there are, if we go back to this document from Diane Montaigne's translation, there are schismatic groups and there are the SSPX, which is a different distinction somehow. But at the same time, there is discord within the church where some groups are not reconciled with the church, but at the same time they're in. And then there's the SSPX that is in a state of non-full communion, but not schism, but also different from the groups that are in but not reconciled. This is the insanity of modernism. So where does this come from? Well, we have a key for this if we look at the way tradition was understood in the old understanding and the new, because it relates to communion, as we'll see. So if I pull up this document here that I wrote a year and a half ago, Vatican I says this is about tradition. The doctrine of faith, which God revealed, has been entrusted as a divine deposit to the spouse of Christ to be faithfully guarded and infallibly interpreted. Hence also the understanding of its sacred dogmas must be perpetually retained, which Holy Mother Church has once declared, and there must never be recession from that meaning under the specious name of a deeper understanding. Modernism rejects this, by the way, and that's in my book, What Happened to Catholicism. You can find that there. And then they quote St. Vincent of Lérins here, which is in the First Vatican Council, and it's from his Commonitorium. He says, therefore let the understanding, the knowledge, and wisdom of individuals as of all, of one man as of the whole church, grow and progress strongly with the passage of the ages and the centuries, but let it be solely in its own genus, namely in the same dogma, with the same sense and the same understanding. Vatican II. How does Vatican II understand tradition? It says the tradition that comes from the apostles makes progress in the church with the help of the Holy Spirit. That statement is probably fine, although there could be some problems, but it's probably fine. It says there's a growth and insight into the realities and words that are being passed on. That's probably fine too. This comes through the contemplation and study of believers who ponder these things in their hearts. This is where it gets problematic. It comes from the intimate sense of spiritual realities which they experience. It gets even more problematic. As the centuries succeed one another, the church constantly moves forward towards the fullness of divine truth until the words of God reach their complete fulfillment in her. What is the insinuation here? The church does not have the fullness of truth yet. That's a big problem. Pius IX said, the Church of Christ, this is the old understanding, watchful guardian that she is and defender of the dogmas deposited with her, never changes anything, never diminishes anything, never adds anything to them. That's from an infallible declaration. Father Ratzinger in 1969. He, talking about St. Vincent of Lérins, no longer appears as an authentic representative of the Catholic idea of tradition, which is problematic considering they quote Vincent of Lérins in the infallible canons of the First Vatican Council, but outlines a canon of tradition based on a semi-Pelagian idea. It's a very problematic statement. Pope Pius X. Tradition is understood by the modernists as a communication with others of an original experience, call to mind what we just read from Vatican II, through preaching by means of the intellectual formula. To this formula, in addition to its representative value, they attribute a species of suggestive efficacy, which acts firstly in the believer by stimulating the religious sense, and secondly in those who do not yet believe by awakening in them for the first time the religious sense and producing the experience. In this way is religious experience spread about among the nations. This is a fancy way of saying that tradition is understood by the modernists is the waking up, the stirring up of something inside. And then that thing is then expressed. And then we share that. And then we mix that together with other expressions. And then we, over time, start to understand tradition better. So it's not something that's handed on to us in its fullness. It's something that's awakened in us partially over time. It's a complete reversal. And this is consistent with Vatican II's logic, what we just read. Pope Benedict XVI said, and this is in 2005, it is clear that this commitment to expressing a specific truth in a new way demands new thinking on this truth and a new and vital relationship with it. The Second Vatican Council, with its new definition of the relationship between the faith of the Church and certain essential elements of modern thought, has reviewed or even corrected certain historical decisions, but in this apparent discontinuity, it has actually preserved and deepened her inmost nature and true identity. So, the old understanding of tradition as fixed, while the new considers it as changing. In the traditional sense, tradition is objective, dogmas, while for the new notion, it is subjective, experiences. Traditionally, man believes what he is told. The modernists tells what he believes. In 2006, Pope Benedict on this note said, "The Church's apostolic tradition consists in the transmission of the goods of salvation, which, through the power of the Spirit, makes the Christian community the permanent actualization of the original communion. Tradition is the communion of the faithful around their legitimate pastors, down through history, a communion that the Holy Spirit nurtures, assuring the connection between the experience of the apostolic faith lived in the original communities of the disciples and the actual experience of Christ in his church." So, tradition, in the modern sense, is communion of lived experience. So if we live like the early church, we have tradition. In the other 19 centuries of Catholic doctrine, tradition is basically the deposit of faith, which is given to us, and we understand it the same way as it's always been understood. There's an element of truth in the new understanding, in that that deposit of faith was experienced in the sense that it was assented to by the first Christians, but that is passed on as a deposit. It's not experienced as this thing that continually awakens. In the modern church, tradition and communion are basically synonymous. This is why traditionalists will never have enough communion, because they don't have the same experiences as their other Catholics, because they don't go to the same Mass. And this is why you can be not a schismatic in the objective sense, but you don't really have enough communion in the subjective sense. So you can be somehow in the church, but not reconciled with it. You can be somehow in the church, but without full communion, which suggests that you can be not reconciled with the church, but still have full communion, which doesn't really make any sense because whatever that means, who knows? And then you can also be a schismatic. Many different ways of being a Catholic in the modern church, because there are many different ways of demonstrating that you're in it to varying degrees. And this is not something that just applies to the SSPX. In 2024, the Fraternity of St. Peter released the following statement, and I'll bring that up and I'll show you. And remember, the Fraternity of St. Peter is not the SSPX. Oh, that's not big enough. Let's move this here. There we go. It says, "The meeting was an opportunity." This is talking about the meeting between the fraternity superiors and the SSPX. And Pope Francis. "The meeting was an opportunity for them to express their deep gratitude to the Holy Father for the decree of February 11th, 2022, by which the Pope confirmed the liturgical specificity of the Fraternity of St. Peter, but also to share with him the difficulties encountering its application. The Pope was very understanding and invited the Fraternity of St. Peter to continue to build up ecclesial communion ever more fully through its own proper charism." What does this mean? Well, it means even if you're in the Fraternity of St. Peter, you still have more communion. Ecclesial means church. So you still have more communion with the church you can build up, which suggests you don't have enough or you don't have it all. But at the same time, you can be not fully built up in your ecclesial communion, but still considered to be part of the church. And this is what makes the conversation about tradition in general so mind-numbingly confusing. It's because of this modernism. And the Fraternity of St. Peter, this is not to criticize unduly, but they deal in this milieu because they want to try to play that game. So they're willing to sort of use modernist terminology because that's what's there, while at the same time holding fast to tradition. That's what's alleged, which would reject these ecclesiological definitions outright. And herein lies the problem. What this is ultimately, my friends, this notion of being in the church, but not fully. Being in the church, but not reconciled to it. Being not in full communion, but also in the church. You have to understand that there are like 4 heresies, philosophically or theologically. It's kind of like, you have the 7 deadly sins, and then you have a zillion different daughters of those sins, different subsets of those sins. So you have this, you have lust as one of the sins. And then there are a million ways that other sins are related to the sort of archetypal type of lust. One could be a glutton in the mortally sinful sense, but then we really talk about that as the virtue of temperance, and then you could be intemperate in other ways. In a similar way with heresies, there's kind of like these archetypal heresies. So there's the sort of form of Christological heresy. So the errors about the nature of Christ. And then under that Christological heresy, you have a zillion different heresies. Everything from Nestorianism to Islam, Arianism, etc. Well, one of these archetypal heresies is Gnosticism. And the church fathers were dealing with this right away. We're talking about in the 1st century, 2nd century. What is Gnosticism? Well, at the heart of Gnosticism is a partial truth, because in all heresies there is a partial truth. Otherwise, people wouldn't believe them. At the heart of Gnosticism is this notion, which is partially true, that you are fully initiated into the spiritual life through knowledge. And again, that's partially true. Because we do assent to a defined deposit of faith. However, we don't actually have to know it to be initiated into the church, do we? Because infants are baptized. And when infants are baptized, they're given the gift of faith through their baptism. But they still have to study for their first communion test, don't they? Because they don't actually intellectually know all the things that are part of the deposit of faith. With Gnosticism, there is only ever full initiation when the mysteries have been revealed. And then at a certain point, when the person is seen as having understood the revealed mysteries enough, then they might become perfected or something like that. You see this in the various Gnostic cults. You also see this in the various heresies of other religions that have emanated over the centuries, like in Islam, the different sects within Islam. And within Judaism, you have this with the sort of Talmudic and Kabbalistic understanding. It's very Gnostic. You see elements of this in the charismatic renewal, which is why there's a huge emphasis on continual revelation and private prophecy. And this is part of modernism, which deals with a continual revelation, a continual unfolding of knowledge. And the more that we understand this continual unfolding of knowledge, the greater we become perfected to that religious impulse. This is Gnosticism. This is what it is in its basic sense. And in order to be initiated into a Gnostic cult, you have to share the same experiences. Otherwise, you don't fully count as a member. Because those experiences come with them certain truths. And again, there's a partial truth to this for the Catholic Church. Because, of course, we have rites of baptism and so on and so forth. And you share in these, and these are evidence of what it signifies. And that's how you are initiated. We also have different liturgical rites, which demonstrate what we believe. But the difference is that traditionally, with the objective understanding of communion, we knew that there were objective criteria that as long as they're satisfied, there can be no question of us being in the church. Subjectively, one would have to be asked and tried, whatever. But objectively, it would be, well, he professes these things, he goes to this place, and he admits so-and-so is the Pope. Nothing more to say. He may be a bad Catholic. He may separate himself from God through mortal sin. But legally speaking, objectively speaking, he is a member of the church. And therefore, he's not a schismatic. He may commit a schismatic sin internally, which he'll be judged for on his own, but we have no evidence of it. And we can't declare it because it's not objective. This goes away with the modern understanding. traditionally, I can look at the church and I can say, all of these different rites of the church, Eastern, the various Easterns, the various Westerns, whatever, they all contain these 10 points. They all transmit what is meant to be believed. They all pray for the Pope, submit to the Pope, at least in principle, pray for the bishops and so forth. And their members, when they approach the sacraments, they approach them as Catholics and show no impediment to their understanding or desire to be known as Catholics along with other Catholics. This is gone in the modern church. And you see this with this recent guy, that voice of reason guy going around saying who is and who is not a true Catholic. No one can really say that. I mean, we could say so-and-so has said heresy. We can recognize heresy. But we can't say no and so-and-so is not really a true Catholic. Because that's very Gnostic. We don't really know if so-and-so is a true Catholic. And when we say things like so-and-so is not a true Catholic, we run the risk of ourselves being like Gnostics. Because we're kind of saying that we possess a certain understanding that we've been initiated into, and we can make judgments on those who don't have the same understanding of us as us. When it comes to subjective things, we just can't do that. But this is the way it's done in the modern church. Everything is very Gnostic because it's very modernist. There's no more objective criteria to be fully in the church. You know, I've joked with my friends. I said, and this is before Pope Francis died, may God rest his soul, but I said, I think the only way that anyone can be fully in communion with Pope Francis is if they basically have a picture of him beside their bed that they kiss before they go to sleep, and they have a Pope Francis stuffy that they snuggle. That might sound funny, but I mean, if it really is about demonstration through experience and closeness in a way that can be seen by others, then we can't ever have enough. I mean, you have to basically be hugging the bishop at all times to fully be with him, if it's based on experience and it's based on closeness. And this is why concelebration is so vital for modernist-minded Catholics in the Latin Rite, because we have to show that we're doing the stuff at the same time and in the same place, and literally like touching each other and touching the same stuff to show that we're in communion with one another. Now, this could be a demonstration of communion, but it's not a definition of it. What this overall assessment has shown us from this document translated by Diane Montaigne, traditionalism is not in communion with the church fully, according to the mind of the modernist prelates. And well, this is why people kind of seek in vain to be quote unquote recognized by their prelates. Because you never will be if you're a trad. Because your TLM community, in the mind of many bishops, not all, but in the mind of many, even where they love the community, they see it as a way of keeping you close to the church. Close to the church. Not in the church. Not a schismatic, though, but close. You're kind of like a neighbor. Because the true Catholics are the ones that are doing the exact same thing with each other all the time. And if you're not going to do that, then you're close, but you're not really there. None of this is reconcilable with tradition. But it is modernism. Thank you, Diane Montaigne, for that article. It occasioned a nice little conversation here. And that's all I got for you today. May God bless you all. Bye-bye.